Welcome to the FinGlimpse podcast, where we analyze the world of business, finance, and the economy. We cover the latest market news, economic trends, and some interesting businesses. As a standard disclaimer, this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Always do your own research. Now, let's get started.
Okay, think about the materials that really power modern life. The stuff in our smartphones, the fertilizers growing our food, the critical bits for EV batteries, elements for renewable energy. Who actually makes those essential building blocks, those fundamental chemicals and minerals the world relies on?
It's a huge question, really. Touches on everything: global supply chains, environmental impact. And our deep dive today, well, it takes us right into that, looking at a major global player.
Mm.
SQM, Sociedad Química y Minera de Chile, S.A. We're going straight to the source material here, their 2024 annual report.
That's right. And this isn't just about skimming the surface. We're digging in, trying to pull out the core insights, the really important nuggets of knowledge from what's, let's be honest, a pretty extensive document.
Exactly.
The goal is to get you quickly up to speed on SQM, their business, strategy, how they handle risks, governance, the whole complex world they operate in. Think of it like your shortcut to understanding a company that's, well, kind of quietly fundamental to so many big industries today.
Okay, so let's maybe kick things off with a snapshot of the company based on those 2024 numbers in the report. High-level view, SQM is truly global. The report says their products reach over 100 countries. And get this, 96% of their sales in 2024, exports.
Wow, 96%. That's a massive global footprint. Now, the financials for that year, the report shows total sales of US $4,529 million. But a number that really jumps out is that net loss. They recorded a loss of US $404 million in 2024.
Yeah.
That's quite a swing from previous years. Definitely catches the eye.
It really does. And the report gives a scale beyond just revenue, too. They employ a pretty substantial workforce, 8,344 contract workers worldwide in 2024. And they specifically point out 22% of their total employees are women.
Yeah.
Seems like they're highlighting that diversity focus.
And the company also went through a pretty big internal change in 2024. The report talks about this corporate reorganization, split operations into three main divisions: SQM Lithium Chile, SQM Lithium International, and SQM Iodine Nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the idea was maybe to create more focused, maybe more nimble units for different markets.
Yeah, that seems to be the logic. And when you look at the 2024 revenues broken down by segment, that structure kind of makes sense. Lithium and its derivatives, that was the biggest driver, 49% of total sales.
Almost half?
Yeah. Then you had specialty plant nutrition and iodine and derivatives, basically tied for second, each bringing in 21%. After that, potassium fertilizers at 6%, industrial chemicals 2%, and then other stuff making up the last 1%.
So, okay, lithium's clearly key, but they're definitely still a major player in nutrients and iodine, too.
Absolutely. And they're investing pretty heavily to grow, especially in lithium. The report highlights some ambitious production capacity plans. Their lithium chemical plant, for example, hit 210,000 metric tons of lithium carbonate capacity in 2024.
Okay.
But the plan is to push that even higher. They're targeting 240,000 metric tons by 2026.
And not just carbonate, right? Hydroxide, too.
Right, they're expanding lithium hydroxide capacity as well, aiming for 100,000 metric tons by the end of 2025. The report mentions key international projects supporting this, like their joint venture in Mount Holland, Australia,
Right.
and a lithium hydroxide refining plant in China. So it shows that strategic build-out isn't just happening in Chile.
Okay, so speaking of strategy, the report seems to emphasize this core approach of integrating sustainability right into how they design and run the business. They explicitly link what they do to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
They do.
Yeah.
And that strategic focus seems to drive their innovation efforts, too. The report talks about R&D, looking at everything from finding new uses for their products, like using lithium sulfate for hydroxide production, or nitrates in solar thermal energy storage,
Interesting.
to improving efficiency, like developing molecules for better water and nutrient use in agriculture, or even exploring iodine's role in farming. It seems to be about finding those high-value applications and optimizing their processes.
Right, adding value. Now, how is the company actually overseen? The report goes into their corporate governance structure. There's a board of directors, key committees like the Directors Committee, Corporate Governance Committee.
Standard stuff, yeah.
And they state they adhere to various standards, both national and international. They mention things like Chile's CMF General Rule 385 that sets corporate governance standards there, plus the UN SDGs, ISO certs like 14001 for environment. Looks like they're trying to align with recognized frameworks.
Yeah, ticking the boxes, it seems. And the report's pretty upfront about executive compensation. For the 9 principal executives in 2024, total comp was 5,311 million Chilean pesos, which, interestingly, is a significant drop from the year before, 8,373 million in 2023.
Wow. Yeah, that is a big difference. Does it say why?
Well, it clarifies that the incentives have fixed and variable parts tied to hitting individual and company performance goals. They mentioned annual and long-term bonus plans, so presumably performance targets weren't met as fully in 2024.
Makes sense.
And they had a provision set aside for these incentive programs, US $65.6 million as of the end of 2024. The report also makes a point of noting that, unlike maybe in the US or elsewhere, they don't have pension or retirement programs for directors or executives based in Chile.
Got it. Okay. All right, now let's shift gears and talk challenges. Every major company faces risks, right? And SQM is definitely no exception. The report lays out their risk management model, says it follows international standards like ISO 31000 and QSOC-OERM.
Right. And essentially, this model is a structured way they find risks, evaluate them, figure out how to handle them, monitor them, and communicate about them. They look at risks based on, the likelihood they'll actually happen and how big the impact would be before considering any mitigation actions.
Yeah.
Gives them that inherent risk picture.
Helps them see the potential hurdles clearly.
Yeah.
And the report lists a whole host of specific risk factors. This is where you really start to see just how complex their business is. Let's maybe group some of the major ones. First up, you've got market and competition risks.
Standard for commodities, yeah.
Exactly. Price volatility is a big one. But they also call out competition from, existing players, new entrants, and significantly the potential for new extraction technologies. They mention direct lithium extraction, DLE.
Yeah, DLE is a really interesting one because it could potentially lower production costs for competitors, right? Or maybe open up new resource deposits that just aren't economical using SQM's traditional brine evaporation methods in the Atacama.
So it's a technological disruption risk,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah.
Could reshape the competitive field.
Could do, yeah. Then you've got operational risks. This is fundamental for a resource extraction company. They rely heavily on efficiently getting lithium from those brines in the Salar de Atacama,
Right.
but also things like global transportation bottlenecks, managing huge inventories, and of course the ever-present risk of accidents or safety incidents in these large-scale industrial operations.
And a huge one, operationally and environmentally, which the report calls out explicitly, is water supply.
Oh yeah, big one.
Operating in places like northern Chile, super arid. Water is scarce, heavily regulated. The report highlights how geology, climate change, and importantly, changes in water permitting can impact their operations.
And that's particularly sensitive given recent changes to Chilean water law, right?
Yeah.
Making rights temporary, prioritizing human consumption.
Exactly. Sounds like a major, major challenge to navigate. Then, shifting focus a bit, there are political and regulatory risks, especially being based in Chile. The report notes general political risks, potential for civil unrest. And specific to their business, there's this uncertainty around the future of the Chilean lithium industry itself. Potential state involvement, like that Codelco partnership we should talk more about, but also just broader policy shifts.
Yeah, and regulatory changes across mining, port concessions, those water rights changes we just mentioned, those are all significant. The report also highlights the potential impact of Chile ratifying ILO Convention 169.
The Indigenous Rights Convention.
Exactly. Which means greater requirements for consulting with indigenous communities on projects that might affect their lands or rights. And there's a real risk of legal challenges to permits if that consultation process isn't done properly or seen as properly done.
You can really see how those regulatory and political risks connect right back to operational stability.
Yeah.
Okay, what else? Shareholder and governance risks.
Right. The report points out that a big chunk of shares is held by just 2 main groups, Papa Group and Tianqi.
And Tianqi is also a major competitor in the lithium space.
Right. Exactly. So Tianqi being a significant shareholder and a competitor creates this really complex dynamic. The report mentions the risks this poses to free competition. It even references ongoing challenges related to agreements they have with Chile's competition authority, the FNE, about managing that potential conflict.
Yeah, that dual role definitely sounds like a point of potential friction or complexity.
For sure. And finally, risks related to ESG and external perception. Basically, if stakeholders, investors, communities, customers feel the company isn't adequately addressing environmental, social, or governance concerns, say around water use or community impact, that could really damage their reputation and even operations.
License to operate issues.
Yeah. They also list risks like public health pandemics, which, we've all become acutely aware of recently.
Man, it's clear they operate in a really complex risk environment. Market, operations, environment, politics, social factors, it's all interconnected. Okay, so how do they manage their biggest asset through all this? Their people.
Right, human capital. The report gives some details. Over 8,300 employees. About 75% of them work in those core operations up in northern Chile.
Tarapacá and Antofagasta regions.
Yep. And they break down the job types. It says 85% fall into categories like operators, other professionals, and technicians. Their strategy here, the report says, is about attracting and keeping talent, building diverse teams, trying to increase female participation, and aiming for more local employment in those regions where they operate.
That focus on diversity and inclusion, D&I, seems like a key part of their human capital approach then. The report details efforts like ensuring no salary discrimination based on subjective factors, using blind recruitment processes, running specific programs to boost representation.
And they mention that 22% female participation figure, again, reiterating the goal to increase it at all levels.
Okay. And labor relations. It must be huge in Chile.
Oh yeah, major component. Especially since, like you said, about 87% of their workforce is in Chile and around 77% of those are unionized across 22 different unions, the report says.
22 unions. Wow.
Yeah. So collective bargaining is a regular and really important process. They note they successfully renewed 14 collective bargaining agreements just in 2024.
So managing those relationships is obviously key to avoiding disruptions. The report mentions exposure to potential strikes or work stoppages.
Standard risk for highly unionized sectors. And the report also touches on the potential financial hit from Chile's ongoing pension system reform. It's set to gradually increase employer contributions over the next 9 years. That's a notable future cost consideration for them.
Right. Okay, what about safety? Critical in mining.
Absolutely critical, yeah. The report calls it a material aspect. SQM uses systematic processes for this, overseen by Chilean government bodies, Ministry of Labor, Health, Cernagimen.
The mining regulator.
Exactly. The report includes specific safety indicators for their main divisions, things like the accident rate per 100 workers, fatality rate. The numbers themselves fluctuate year to year, obviously, but reporting them shows that focus on tracking these key metrics.
And they also detail policies and procedures around harassment and violence in the workplace.
They do. Mention investigation processes, training efforts. They reference recent Chilean legislation, the CRIN law, aimed at preventing and sanctioning workplace harassment. They report on the number of internal complaints received in 2024, breaking them down by type: sexual harassment, labor harassment, and state that cases are handled according to regulations.
Okay. And the report touches on maternity leave compliance and lists some employee benefits, health insurance, bonuses, etc.
Yeah, standard benefits packages.
Got it. Now, another significant piece of their ESG work seems to be responsible sourcing.
Yes. Their policy requires suppliers to progressively adopt criteria that align with SQM's own sustainability principles.
So pushing standards down the supply chain.
Exactly. It includes things like ensuring suppliers respect human rights in their own operations, comply with anti-corruption laws, make sure their supply chains are free of conflict minerals. They mention alignment with OECD guidelines there. Maintain safe workplaces, treat their own employees fairly. They say they evaluate suppliers on these criteria, and serious non-compliance can lead to ending the business relationship. It shows they're trying to extend that sustainability focus beyond just their own operations.
Right, makes sense. Okay, transitioning now to environmental management. Obviously, absolutely critical for a company operating in sensitive ecosystems like the Atacama Desert. The report emphasizes environmental protection throughout their processes.
And water management is front and center here. They get water from rivers, wells. The report highlights, crucially, the significant commitment they've made to reduce brine extraction by 50% by 2028 in the Salar de Atacama.
50% reduction in brine extraction. That's huge.
It's a massive undertaking, yeah. Clearly aimed at addressing one of the key environmental concerns associated with lithium production there. They also note reductions in inland water consumption in their Lithium Chile division.
And they mentioned that online monitoring portal, right? SQMSenlinea.com.
Yeah, they point to that as providing public environmental data for their Salar operations, a step towards transparency on these, very sensitive issues.
Okay. What about waste?
Detailed plans and procedures for hazardous and non-hazardous waste. In 2024, they report sending 85% of their industrial waste for final disposal in authorized facilities, while 15% was recycled. They even mentioned a recycling partnership for their Santiago offices. Little things, but they add up.
Right. And climate change, GHG emissions.
Yep, they estimate their carbon footprint using international standards, GHG protocol, and so on. Their total GHG emissions in 2024 were significant, over 1.9 million tons of CO2 equivalent across scopes 1, 2, and 3.
And regulations around that. Carbon taxes.
The report touches on things like the Chilean carbon tax, which currently affects facilities over a certain thermal capacity. SQM paid some related to a boiler in 2024, but they note the risk that this tax could be applied more broadly in the future.
So a potential cost increase down the line.
Could be. They also mention using an internal carbon price when they evaluate new projects, which means when they consider a new investment, they factor in a cost for the carbon emissions it might create. The idea is to encourage choosing lower impact alternatives from the get-go.
Smart. And they highlight certifications too, like ISO standards.
Yeah, various ISO certs, 14001 for environmental management, 5001 for energy management. They note their iodine plant was apparently the first globally to get that ISO 5001 energy efficiency certification. These provide some external validation of their systems.
Okay, so beyond the environmental systems, connecting with the local population seems vital. The report stresses the importance of community relations, calls it a fundamental pillar.
Yeah, they frame their approach as being tailored to local needs, aiming for, real positive change, and working with communities to develop social programs.
Any example?
They give some. Yeah. Supporting agricultural projects, which is obviously key for local livelihoods in arid areas. Entrepreneurship initiatives. They also mention projects focused on cultural and historical heritage, preserving local Pampan roots or indigenous legacy, especially around their northern operations, like Maria Elena.
And how do they engage?
Says it involves everything from daily interactions to more formal consultations. The report notes they often use their own personnel for community outreach and indigenous consultations, which could, help build more direct relationships rather than just relying on external consultants all the time.
And the report is honest about potential negative impacts on communities, too.
It is, yeah. It acknowledges potential impacts, both environmental and social things like water contamination risk, ecosystem alteration, loss of trust. It states these are managed through dialogue, ongoing monitoring, including that environmental monitoring of water levels, air quality, flora, fauna, and social monitoring to understand community perception. It's framed as being about due diligence and having plans to address issues if they arise.
Right, risk management again. Okay, finally, let's quickly wrap up by looking at some key legal and recent financial points from the report. They mention several Chilean laws. They're subject to criminal liability, economic crimes laws.
Yeah, standard compliance stuff. But they also detail some significant ongoing legal challenges, like those big tax claims from the SII, the Chilean Tax Authority, totaled nearly $1 billion paid as of the end of 2024. And the report notes the legal battles over those past assessments are still ongoing. Mentions a specific court ruling in April 2024 that actually went against SQM Solar.
So that's not fully resolved.
Doesn't sound like it. And that DGA sanction process about water permits in the Salar de Atacama, which we mentioned as a risk. That's noted here, too, as a key regulatory process they're actively managing. Plus, changes to the mining code, the potential impact of ILO 169, all listed as important legal considerations.
Got it. And key events in 2024 specifically.
Well, there's a board decision on some accounting related to mining taxes. They issued a big bond, US $850 million in September, mainly to refinance debt and fund general corporate stuff like capital expenditures. They also modified their policy on transactions with related parties, perhaps linked to that Tianqi situation.
Maybe.
And a huge one, obviously, very high-profile event noted in the report, entering into that association agreement with Codelco, the state-owned copper giant, in May 2024.
Right, the big lithium partnership.
Exactly. That's a massive strategic development for the future of lithium extraction in the Salar de Atacama, a real game changer potentially.
Okay, so bringing this all together, diving into this SQM 2024 annual report, it really shows you a company that's, well, pretty central to the global economy, right?
Yeah.
Providing materials crucial for the future, but one that operates in a fundamentally challenging and complex environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You really see the interplay of all these forces. Global market dynamics, the unique specifics of resource extraction from places like the Atacama, navigating Chile's dynamic regulatory and political landscape, managing social responsibilities with communities and indigenous groups, balancing the interests of diverse shareholders. It's all in there.
It really highlights just how much goes into supplying these building blocks for our modern world. And it definitely gives you a much, much richer picture than you'd ever get from just reading a news headline about them.
For sure. It reveals all those layers: environmental, social, governance, political, economic, and how they're completely intertwined for a company like this.
Which I guess leaves us with this thought to ponder. As global demand for critical materials like lithium and essential chemicals just keeps growing, right? Placing more and more pressure on resources and ecosystems. How can large resource companies like SQM effectively balance meeting that huge demand with ensuring local communities genuinely benefit, and that the environmental and social risks in the regions where these resources are found are truly mitigated over the long term? It's a massive, massive question facing the world today.
That's all for this episode of the FinGlimpse podcast. If you found our discussion insightful, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions for future topics. Until next time, stay informed and make smart decisions. Goodbye.